오늘의 행사를 힘차게 열어주는 오프닝 영상이었습니다. 네, 여러분 박수 감사합니다. 오늘 포럼 여러분 큰 기대해 주셔도 되겠고요. 그럼 본격적으로 포럼을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 첫 번째 세션 발표는 미네르바스쿨 설립자이자 또 CEO이신 벤 넬슨 CEO님의 강연이 준비되어 있습니다. 자, 여러분들 벤 넬슨 CEO님 큰 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being here in Seoul, one of my favorite cities in the world, one of the cities that I picked to host the students from our own university. So today, I wanted to talk to you about two things that may seem like they don't connect with one another, but actually we believe are highly related. First, I'm going to try to prove to you that at first you don't believe something you think you do believe, and then I'm going to prove to you that you indeed do believe that thing. And I hope that won't be too confusing. Then I want to talk to you about how it is that you can bring something that you believe is important to the world at large, and the approach on how to make that effective. Okay? So those are the two broad topics. So let's start by asking for your participation. Luckily, this is the beginning of the conference, so you haven't had a chance to fall asleep yet. And so I'm going to ask you for a show of hands. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions. So first, can I just see a show of hands for the people in the room who have children? Who here has children? Raise your hands. I have a child. Keep your hands raised. Okay. And for those of you who have children, I would like for you to keep your hands up unless you don't love your children. Anybody who doesn't love their children, you can put your hands down. Okay. Oh, you don't? Okay. That's it. So, in general, we care about our children. We care about them greatly, and there are many of you in this room that have children. Now let me ask you a different question. How many of you in this room believe that education matters? That education is important? Okay, that seems like everybody. Okay, wonderful. So now I will try to prove to you that you don't believe that education matters. Okay? Now I need you to be honest, because you just said something and I'm trying to prove that you don't actually believe it. So we'll see if I can make this happen. So think about your children. For those of you who don't have children yet, think about your future children. And imagine that your child just finished their time in high school. And they're applying to university. Let's say they get accepted by two universities. The first is Seoul National University. You may have heard of them. Have you heard of them? Yes. Famous university. The second university, we won't name, but it's another Korean university which is not well regarded at all. In the rankings, it's far, far, far below Seoul National University. However, you know that if your child were to go to that other university, not to Seoul National University, but to the other one, they would get a much better education. Now be honest, How many of you in this room would tell your child, say no to Seoul National University and go to that other university? How many of you would do that? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe. So here's something fascinating. Before I asked you, do you believe that education is important? 100% of the people in this room raised their hand. It was obvious, of course education is important. Yet when I actually gave you a choice to make a decision about the person you love the most, many of you, almost all of you, chose something that doesn't optimize for their education. This should be troubling. Now, let me prove to you that you actually truly do care about education. Now, don't think of yourself as a parent. Think of yourself in your regular job. You're a hiring manager. You're interviewing someone to work for you. And you have 2 candidates. One of the candidates is a graduate of Seoul National University, just graduated. Excellent grades, did a terrible job in the interview, had an awful interview. It was really, really bad. The second candidate graduated from a very bad school, very low ranked, high grades, did very well in that school, same as the student from the Seoul National University. But during your interview, this candidate could take a problem, break it down into its component parts, take those component parts, piece them back together again for a creative solution to a problem that you asked them about. Then, without you prompting them, they would think about what would happen with that solution as it gets implemented and how it would actually be changed by the environment that it's being implemented in, and therefore modified their proposed solution, and were able to clearly communicate to you what that solution was, so much so that you wanted in the interview to implement whatever this person said. One candidate graduated close to the top of their class from the best university in Korea. The other graduated near the top of their class from one of the worst universities in Korea. But one did poorly in your interview, and the other one did extraordinarily well. How many of you here would hire the second candidate over the first? You have to raise your hands if you're going to do it. Okay? How many of you would hire the student that did poorly in the interview but graduated from Seoul National University? Nobody. Guess what? You're cured. You care about education. You think that education matters. Now, this is fascinating. Because when we make decisions as hiring managers, we think about what's good for our company. Yet somehow, when we make decisions with the expectation of what the hiring manager would do, we think that they wouldn't do what's best for their company. Because if you were to understand the dynamic, you would realize that a better education is vastly more important than a brand. It is actually what will determine the success of that individual. And you know this to be true. Now, the reality is that in today's world, we don't always have the luxury of going back to the early days and steering students to one particular educational program versus another. Many of you in this room are frustrated because the students that you hire, whether they come from the best or the worst universities or anywhere in between, aren't ready for the kinds of jobs you expect them to do. And you require supplementary training to get them to a level where you can trust them to do the kinds of jobs you expect them to perform. And so how do you think about what is an effective program to provide a great education for your best and brightest employees? And this is where the Minerva system is so useful as an example. The Minerva education, though it has many aspects to it, has one core concept, and that is what psychologists refer to as far transfer. Now, I'll explain a little bit about what far transfer means, because it's important to understand at the heart of this new type of education. Now, think about the way that education is done today. How many of you here, again, this will require your show of hands, how many of you here today have been working for more than 10 years? Raise your hands if you've been working for more than 10 years. Okay, now, keep your hands raised, raise them high. Anybody who's worked for more than 10 years, look around, see how many people have their hands up. Keep your hand up if the job you're doing today is the same or similar to the job you did right after you graduated from college. How many of you are doing the same job today that you did 10 plus years ago in your very first job? Very few of you. Some of you, but very few. Now, the reality is that through your career, you will change jobs, you will change roles and positions. You will find yourselves in different contexts. Let me ask you another question, whether you've been working for 10 years or less. How many of you that have been trained or have been working, that is, in one job, two jobs, four jobs since you've graduated, how many of those jobs did your education prepare you to hit the ground running and be successful at? Anybody? One guy in the back. This is a problem. But it's obvious in the way that education is currently delivered. Why? Because education is provided within a context. You study physics or history or biology, but you don't work in one disciplinary field. In fact, what you encounter in the real world is never what you can study in school, because universities don't know what any one person will encounter. They can't predict it, let alone all of the things that you will encounter. And so the ultimate goal of education is to teach you tools that you can apply no matter what you do. You learn something in one context, and then you use it in a different context. Guess what? Human beings are terrible at doing this. Let me give you an example to illustrate that. Now imagine that you don't feel well. You go to a doctor. You say, "Doctor, I don't feel well." The doctor says, "Oh, okay. Here, take this pill." And she waits until you take the pill and swallow it. And she says, "Okay, now that you've taken your medication, let's figure out what's wrong with you." Anybody who thinks that this is a good doctor? No, clearly not. We all know, and the doctor certainly knows, before you prescribe a medication, you need to diagnose the illness. Obviously, you figure out what's wrong with the patient first before you tell them what medication to take. Simple. This particular doctor in our story has been asking diagnosis questions 20 times a day for 30 years. It's completely and utterly routine. We as patients know this, but this doctor is a master at it. She knows how to make this great diagnosis. She diagnoses things all the time. After a long day, this doctor goes home. And she sees her husband. He does something annoying, as husbands do. And they get into a fight. Get into an argument. How many doctors do you think would say, "Wait, let's not fight. Let's understand what is the root cause that's making us get into an argument, and let's address that root cause"? Does this sound like something doctors you know would do? No. Actually, it turns out, at least in the United States, doctors have a higher divorce rate than the average professional. Why is that? Isn't it clear that the doctor should know how to diagnose the root cause of a problem rather than addressing its symptom? Isn't that what the doctor does every day of her entire professional career? The reason that doctors can be excellent diagnostics in medicine, but terrible diagnostics in interpersonal relationships, is because they don't understand that it's the same concept. Figure out what problem needs to be solved before you start solving it. They weren't taught diagnostics in that way. They were taught it by saying, figure out what the illness is before you decide how to fix the illness. But they don't think that interpersonal arguments is the same model. They don't think about when you pass legislation or talk about what law or political party you support, that legislation needs to understand systematic root causes as opposed to deal with the external symptoms. And so this is the difference between an education that is geared in subject versus an education that is built to be transferable. Highlight a learning objective, contextualize it in a context, and then recontextualize it over and over again until the student understands how to apply it in any field that they come across. Ultimately, this is what the workforce needs. They need tools and the ability to apply them to any context that they encounter. Because even when you hire somebody for a job, you don't know day to day what they'll encounter. Are they going to be negotiating with a partner from a different culture? Are they going to have to deal with a new regulation that they've never encountered before? Are they going to have conflict with a different employee in various ways? But there is a set of learning objectives and principles that can help them be successful in all of these situations. Now, the reality is that this kind of education involves many different aspects than the kind of education that we are all used to. It requires a highly structured curriculum. It requires deep participation and processing by the learner themselves. It requires a feedback system that actually provides students formative development as they progress through their educational program, whether it's a short course or a full degree. But those types of requirements are not conducive to the format of education that we are used to, namely, a professor standing on a stage talking to students. It requires a different approach to education that in many ways cannot be achieved without data. You need data to measure how well a student does on a learning objective, and then across how many contexts has that student applied that learning objectives so that they can transfer it. You need data to see how deeply the student has processed the information, and whether or not they get a depth of mastery that makes sense. You need data to be able to give the student coaching as to what they should be studying further or working on more to improve both the depth and breadth of what they've learned. And where you need data, technology can be helpful. And this brings us to the second part of what I wanted to talk to you today, which is that technology can be a crucial solution to generate a new type of educational outcome. But the approach to technology should be different than what most of you think about when you think about implementing technological tools. Many of the technologies that get developed are built as technological solutions. And then the technological providers try to implement them in existing infrastructure. Think of a technology from that perspective that would help you get from one place to another place easier. So imagine you were to say, you know, Seoul has a great subway system, but sometimes you want to take a cab, a taxi. And you know, when you kind of raise your hand and hope to flag a taxi down, sometimes they pass you by. So how can you create a technology that will improve the hailing of the taxi cab? Well, from that approach, what you would do is you take a phone, and you have a button to turn on the flashlight, so that way when you wave your hand, the taxi cab would see the flashlight better. A different approach would be to say, well, if I'm somewhere and I want to go somewhere else, I want to know that a taxi will come to me. I want to know how long it'll take to get there, and I want to know how much it'll cost. By the way, why do I need to do that with a taxi? Maybe I can use any car. And that's how ride-sharing started. It wasn't how to use technology to improve what is currently being done. It was how do you achieve an objective that is much better for the end user, and how do you do so in such a way by creating a brand new solution. Similarly, in education, rather than thinking about how do you more efficiently deliver a lecture, or how do you ensure that certain bits of information that you're currently learning in one way are delivered to you in a different way, instead, think about what are the end goals that I'm trying to achieve. I want a workforce that can deal with complex problems in brand new contexts they've never encountered before. In the current tool set that I have, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to put a group of my employees in a set of offline classes and get them to that point. What kinds of technologies need to be built in order to enable a brand new kind of educational outcome? Rather than building the flashlight app, how do you build a brand new approach? And that's ultimately where something that is crucial, because as we discussed, you believe that education matters, gets married to a technology that enables it. Now let's backtrack and talk about what it means and what the outcomes are when you marry these two things together. So at Minerva, we have, I think quite famously, launched the most selective and most effective undergraduate university program in the world. And we've done so from scratch in 5 years. But what most people don't know is that the underlying techniques, the research that Minerva is based on, was actually done not for the very, very best students, as we have at our university, but was done on a broad cross-section of students, many of whom struggled with their traditional studies. Because that research was so broad-based, over the past couple of years, we've been able to take the same system of education and implement it in varying contexts. First, we brought a Minerva education to students from all over the world. We've now educated students from more than 60 different countries with very similar results. Transformative undergraduate education, the likes of which have never been seen. We've also transferred our education into different levels of education. We've used Minerva programs to teach advanced high school students. We've launched programs at the master's level. We've used the Minerva system to provide leadership accelerator courses for executives in corporations. And we've done so across contexts of culture. We've implemented these types of solutions in South America, in the United States, in Korea, in China, in Hong Kong, in France. And we continue to expand the context in which we provide these systems. Now, the reason that we spend so much time and effort in bringing the Minerva system to other locations is because we believe that education matters. So I wanted to give you an example about how broadly and what kind of impact this education can have. And I wanted to give you two countervailing points of view. One of the implementations that we've done is in India, where we took a curriculum we've never taught before, that we built especially for this partner, in a new implementation of our system that addressed more students than we've ever addressed before, under conditions that we've never encountered before, for hundreds of learners. And for the past 2 months, as we've been running this program, the results have been astonishing. Students that have never before been engaged in their learning show up to class prepared, make dramatic advances in their learning, and in fact, perform better in their other classes, even the ones that are not on the Minerva system, because of what they learn from the Minerva system. And now, go to the other end of the spectrum. A Korean company where executives are sitting in and being involved in their learning through the Minerva system. Where when we go and ask them at the end of the program, how did you improve your competency level in the learning objectives that we had? You have 92% of the participants saying that their improvement has been significant, not minor, but dramatic increases. Have you ever heard of a learning and development program in a corporation that achieves those types of results? Have you ever heard of a program that has taken students from impoverished backgrounds and was able to transform their educational trajectory? And so the reason that we're able to implement these types of solutions in such different contexts is because we commit to creating solutions that matter because education matters. And so with that, I hope that as you think about how you implement your educational solutions, as you think about your workforce management, that you don't think about incremental solutions, but instead envision the kind of organization you should have, and then figure out what needs to be built to enable you to get there. Best of luck with that. Thank you.